They thought they were untouchable. Officers Briggs and Reynolds had brutalized the innocent for years. But when they gunned down an unarmed man, they didn't know his twin brother was a decorated Delta Force commander. Now, Isaiah Carter isn't just grieving, he's delivering justice, and nothing will stand in his way. Malcolm and Isaiah Carter, twin brothers, were cruising through a well-to-do suburban neighborhood in their Dodge Charger, headed to see their sister, Ava, a respected civil rights attorney. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across manicured lawns, but inside the car, a quiet storm brewed. Malcolm, fed up with the weight of racial prejudice they'd carried since childhood, let his frustrations spill out. His voice was sharp, cutting through the hum of the engine as he recounted the slights, the stares, the countless times they'd been judged before they could even speak. Isaiah, ever the steady one, listened in silence. He was the planner, the one who held his feelings close, always searching for a way to keep the peace. Then, out of the corner of their eyes, they saw it. A police cruiser making a slow, deliberate U-turn. The brothers exchanged a look, a wordless understanding passing between them. They'd been here before, too many times to count. The air grew heavy, thick with dread, as blue and red lights flared behind them, slicing through the calm of the evening. Malcolm sighed, his irritation simmering beneath a forced calm, and flicked on the blinker. He pulled over to the curb, both of them careful to keep their hands in plain sight, as two officers, Briggs and Reynolds, stepped out and approached. What should have been a routine stop turned ugly fast. Briggs, a burly man with a scowl etched deep, barked for their IDs without so much as a "how do you do?" Malcolm, his patience worn thin, asked why they'd been stopped. His tone was firm, but civil, the kind of question any man might ask. Reynolds, younger and twitchy, shot back that they matched a description of some suspect. Vague words that hung in the air like a bad excuse. Briggs didn't wait for more talk. He ordered Malcolm out of the car, his voice hard as steel. Malcolm, standing his ground, refused without a clear reason. The tension thickened, a storm ready to break. Isaiah, sensing the danger, leaned forward, his voice low and measured, trying to cool things down like he always did. But then it happened, quick as a heartbeat. Briggs grabbed Malcolm's arm, rough and sudden. Malcolm flinched, just a reflex, nothing more. "Weapon!" Briggs shouted, his voice piercing the night, though Malcolm hadn't even moved to fight back. Before anyone could blink, a gunshot cracked through the stillness, sharp and final. Malcolm crumpled to the ground, a dark stain spreading across his chest. Isaiah's scream tore from his throat, raw and desperate, as his brother, his twin, his mirror, lay dying on the cold pavement. Briggs and Reynolds didn't hesitate. They turned on Isaiah, pinning him down, fists flying as he struggled, helpless, watching Malcolm's life slip away. Blood pooled beneath his brother, dark and glistening under the streetlights, while the officers shouted over him. Briggs, panting, grabbed his radio and spoke into it with a chilling calm. Suspect resisted. Officer discharged weapon in self-defense. The words were cold, mechanical, stripping away the truth of what had just happened. Isaiah, bruised and broken, could only stare at Malcolm's still form, the other half of his soul gone in an instant. Just like that, Malcolm Carter, a man with dreams, a family, a story, was reduced to a number, a statistic in a system that had never seen him as anything more. The night closed in, silent now, but the echoes of that shot lingered, a haunting reminder of a stop that changed everything. Isaiah sat in the dim light of a holding cell, his body aching from the beating, his heart shattered by the loss of Malcolm. The cold concrete walls, seemed to press in on him, amplifying the grief that gnawed at his soul. Then came Ava, storming through the precinct like a force of nature. Her eyes blazed with fury, her voice steady but sharp as she demanded his release. She knew the game too well, how the system would twist this tragedy into something unrecognizable. Briggs and Reynolds weren't new to this. They'd walked away from messes like this before, their badges untarnished, their consciences untroubled. The media frenzy started almost at once. Police statements trickled out, slick and practiced, labeling Malcolm a potential suspect in some vague, unnamed crime. Isaiah had handed over a photo from Malcolm's college graduation, his brother beaming in a cap and gown, but the news didn't care. They dug up an old mugshot instead, a blurry snapshot from a minor scrape years back, plastering it across screens to fit the narrative. The system was already at work, shielding the guilty, painting Malcolm as the villain in his own death. Isaiah could feel it closing in, a machine too big to fight, too entrenched to falter. Across town, Briggs and Reynolds sat in a dimly lit bar, the clink of glasses cutting through their low laughter. They swapped stories, their voices loose with whiskey and arrogance, marveling at how easy it was to bury cases like this. A quick report, a few key phrases, and the whole thing would blow over. They'd seen it before, knew the playbook by heart. Meanwhile, Isaiah, finally released, sat in Ava's living room, staring at the TV in silence. The news ticker scrolled endlessly, but it was Briggs's face that stopped him cold. There he was, in his pressed uniform, looking into the camera with a practiced solemnity. "I feared for my life," he said, his voice steady. "He left us no choice." The words hit Isaiah like a punch, each syllable a nail in the coffin of the truth. Isaiah let out a slow breath, his jaw tightening until it ached. He turned to Ava, who stood nearby, her arms crossed, her own anger simmering just beneath the surface. "The system won't save us," he said, his voice low, resolute. It wasn't a question. It was a fact, carved deep into his bones by a lifetime of watching justice slip through their fingers. Ava met his gaze, her eyes fierce but steady. "Then we make them pay another way," she replied, her words carrying the weight of a vow. She was a lawyer, a fighter in the courtroom, but even she knew the limits of a broken system. Isaiah nodded, a flicker of agreement passing between them. But deep down, something darker had already taken root in him. He didn't say it aloud, didn't need to. Justice wasn't a gift handed down from on high. It was a fire you had to light yourself. Malcolm's blood still stained the pavement, his last breath stolen by men who'd never face a reckoning. Isaiah could see it now. The reports filed, the headlines fading, the world moving on while they were left to drown in the wreckage. Briggs and Reynolds thought they'd won, thought they could laugh it off over cheap drinks. But Isaiah wasn't done. He'd lost his twin, his other half, and that wound wouldn't heal with time or tears. Ava might fight with words, but Isaiah was ready for something more. The system had failed them. Now it was his turn to take what was owed. Isaiah vanished into the night, leaving no trace behind. The police assumed he'd fled, a broken man running from his grief. They couldn't have been more wrong. Delta Force had forged him into something else, a shadow, a ghost trained to move unseen, to strike without warning. Now, those skills, honed in far-off deserts and jungles, turned inward, aimed at the men who'd taken Malcolm from him. He didn't run. He hunted. Briggs and Reynolds became his focus, their lives laid bare under his relentless gaze. He studied them like a predator studies prey, their routines, their habits, the little secrets they thought were safe. It didn't take long to dig up the dirt. Hidden in dusty files and hushed whispers, Isaiah found a trail of brutality complaints stretching back years. Each one buried, swept under the rug by a system that protected its own. These weren't just bad cops. They were wolves in uniforms, preying on the vulnerable, secure in the knowledge they'd never pay. The realization hardened something in Isaiah, turning his grief into a cold, sharp edge. He wasn't after justice anymore, not the kind courts handed out. This was personal. This was retribution. And Reynolds, the twitchy one with the quick temper, would be the first to feel it. Isaiah waited outside the bar Reynolds frequented, a dive on the edge of town, where the neon buzzed and the air smelled of stale beer. The officer stumbled out, half drunk, his laughter cutting through the quiet night as he fumbled with his keys. He never saw the shadow detach from the alley wall. Before he could blink, a steel-strong arm clamped around his throat, yanking him into the darkness. Reynolds hit the ground hard, the wind knocked out of him, his blurry eyes wide with panic. Isaiah loomed over him, a silhouette against the faint streetlight. "This is how Malcolm felt," he said, his voice low, steady, carrying the weight of a final judgment. Reynolds begged, his words slurring into desperate pleas. But Isaiah wasn't there to kill. Death would have been too quick, too clean. Instead, he delivered a single precise strike, a technique from his Delta Force days, targeting the nerves in Reynolds's spine. The man's body jerked, then went still, his hands useless at his sides. He'd live, but he'd never hold a gun again, never wield power over anyone. Isaiah stood, leaving Reynolds crumpled in the dirt, a broken shell of the man who'd helped end Malcolm's life. By morning, the media erupted. Headlines screamed, "Police officer attacked, manhunt for ex-Delta Force soldier." The department scrambled, fear rippling through the ranks. This wasn't a fugitive on the run. This was a trained operative with nothing left to lose. Briggs felt the noose tightening. He stormed into Ava's house, his gun drawn, sweat beading on his forehead. The air crackled with his desperation as he towered over her, his voice a guttural snarl. "Where is he?" Ava didn't flinch. She stood her ground, her eyes locked on his, calm and unyielding. "You already know," she said, her words a quiet challenge. Briggs's hand trembled on the trigger, his bravado crumbling under the weight of her stare. He'd spent years hiding behind his badge, but now the hunter was closing in, and he could feel it. Those unseen eyes watching, waiting. He'd underestimated Isaiah, thought him just another grieving brother. He was wrong. Isaiah was there, just beyond the light, a shadow blending into the night. He'd seen Briggs pull up, watched him barge into Ava's home, gun in hand. Every move the man made only fueled the fire in Isaiah's chest. This wasn't over. Not yet. Briggs could rage, could threaten, but the hunt had only begun. Isaiah tightened his grip on the resolve that drove him. One down, one to go. The system might shield Briggs for now, but not for long. Time was running out, and Isaiah was patient. Patient enough to wait for the perfect moment to strike. Briggs gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white, his eyes darting to the rearview mirror every few seconds. The road stretched dark and endless before him, but he couldn't shake the feeling that Isaiah was out there, closing in. He drove like a man possessed, swerving through quiet streets, his breath ragged with paranoia. He didn't know Isaiah wasn't tailing him, not in the way he feared. There was no need to chase. A small tracker, slipped beneath Briggs's car days ago, hummed silently, feeding Isaiah every twist and turn. Briggs thought he was running, but he was a mouse in a maze, guided straight to the reckoning. It came late that night, on a deserted stretch of highway, where the wind whispered through the trees. Isaiah watched from a distance, his headlights off, until the moment was right. Then, with a roar of the engine, he gunned his car forward, slamming into Briggs's vehicle with calculated force. Metal screeched as Briggs's car spun out, tires squealing against asphalt before it smashed into a guardrail. The impact jolted Briggs forward, his head banging against the wheel. Dazed, he fumbled with the door, stumbling out into the cool night air, his gun shaking in his hand. He blinked through the haze, trying to steady himself, but Isaiah was already there, calm, silent, inevitable. Briggs raised his weapon, his voice a hoarse yell, but it was over before it began. Isaiah moved like a shadow, closing the distance in an instant. With a flick of his wrist, he twisted the gun from Briggs's grip, sending it clattering to the pavement. Briggs swung a wild fist, but Isaiah sidestepped, grabbing the man's arm and driving him face first into the dirt. Briggs thrashed, his bravado crumbling, but Isaiah pinned him with a knee pressed hard into his back. "How does it feel?" Isaiah asked, his voice low and steady, cutting through the night like a blade. Briggs gasped, choking on his own fear, his pleas spilling out in broken fragments. He begged for his life, his words a pitiful echo of the power he'd once wielded. Isaiah's mind flashed to Malcolm, his twin, his anchor, crumpled on that suburban street, blood pooling beneath him. He could hear Malcolm's last words, faint but fierce. "Don't let them get away with this." The memory burned, fueling the fire in his chest. Killing Briggs would have been simple, too simple. A bullet would end it quick, let the man slip away without truly paying. Isaiah wanted more than death. He wanted Briggs to live, to carry the weight of his sins every day, stripped of the control he'd abused for so long. With a precise motion, another skill from his Delta Force years, Isaiah drove his hand into a nerve cluster at the base of Briggs's spine. The man's body jerked, then went limp below the waist, his legs useless. He'd breathe, he'd see, but he'd never walk again, never loom over anyone with that smug authority. Isaiah rose, leaving Briggs sprawled in the dirt, a broken man whimpering into the night. He melted back into the shadows, the hum of his car fading as he disappeared. By dawn, the media was ablaze. Headlines screamed of a rogue ex-soldier, a vigilante striking at the heart of the police force. "Officer paralyzed in brutal attack," they cried, while talking heads speculated wildly on air. The department reeled, their ranks shaken by a ghost they couldn't catch. Briggs was alive, but his career, his life as he'd known it, was over. Isaiah had kept his promise to Malcolm, not with blood, but with something sharper, a justice that lingered, a punishment that echoed. The night swallowed his tracks, and somewhere out there, Isaiah moved on, a man who'd faced the system and made it tremble. The nation split wide open after that night, voices rising in a storm of argument that echoed from coast to coast. To some, Isaiah was a hero, a man who'd stood up when the system failed, delivering a justice long overdue. To others, he was a criminal, a menace who'd crossed a line no one should. The police brass didn't hesitate. They branded him a domestic terrorist, their words dripping with outrage as they vowed to hunt him down. But then the tide turned. Whispers became shouts as the truth clawed its way out. Briggs's buried misconduct files surfaced, years of complaints ignored, lives ruined under his watch. Reynolds's old brutality cases bubbled up too, each one a scar on the department's facade. The victims, silenced for so long, finally found their voices, and the system couldn't shove it all back into the dark. Ava took up the fight where Isaiah left off, wielding the law like a sword. She battled in courtrooms, her resolve unshakable, until Malcolm's name was cleared. No more suspect, No more mugshot lies. The world knew him now as the man he'd been. A brother, a son, a life stolen. Isaiah, though, was gone. A phantom slipping through the cracks of a world he'd shaken to its core. A year later, Ava stood at Malcolm's grave, the grass soft under her feet, the headstone gleaming in the afternoon sun. She brushed her fingers over his name, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "You did good, Isaiah," she whispered, her voice carrying a quiet pride. The wind rustled the trees, but she felt him, out there, somewhere. In the shadows beyond the cemetery, Isaiah watched, his figure blending into the dusk. His sister's words reached him, a balm to the ache he'd carried since that fateful stop. He'd kept his promise to Malcolm, not with words, but with action, leaving a legacy etched in the cracks of a broken system. With a final glance, he turned and faded into the night once more, a ghost who'd changed everything. Was Isaiah right to take justice into his own hands? Leave a 1 in the comments if you stand with him, a 2 if you believe the law should have prevailed. Or tell us, what would you do? Like, subscribe, and stay with us for more gripping tales.